Hello, everybody, and welcome to our session today, Is Conduct and Culture the Next Regulatory Priority? My name is Catherine Falla, and I'm part of the content team here at Global Relay, and will be the moderator for our session. Join with me today, I have our three knowledgeable speakers who will be sharing their insight on the topic at hand. So I have Vlada Grvic, Banal Thakur, and Sania Chowdhury with me. Vlada Grvic, a legal professional, works in ESG finance, arbitration, and responsible technology initiatives, and is focused on integrating legal strategy with corporate governance and compliance. Banal Thakur, a compliance manager, works in overseeing surveillance compliance programs and works closely with regulators in ensuring that firms are meeting the intensifying regulatory requirements set up by regulators like the SEC. And Sania Chowdhury, a regulatory subject matter expert, also worked in the financial services, overseeing compliance frameworks and controls, and currently assists registered firms with their technology adoption journey. So as a little bit of a lead up to today's discussion, we've seen US regulators' concentration on the topic of conduct and culture develop over the years. And we've seen a steady increase over the past several years of statements, speeches, guidelines, and regulations on the topic and its role in finance. And regulators across the field have weighed in with their commentary on this, such as the Federal Reserve, particularly the New York Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, FINRA, the DOJ, and the OCC, just to name a few. And they all have highlighted how good culture and proper conduct all feed into comprehensive risk governance, client trustworthiness, and market integrity, just as a few underlying themes. So in today's discussion, our speakers will be sharing their thoughts on conduct and culture and what the trend is and what it's going to look like, how these points tie into compliance and integrity, and we'll also be sharing some pointers on how to cultivate a positive culture and encourage appropriate conduct within organizations to keep up with these growing expectations. So just as a note, we recently published a conduct and culture timeline that highlights the evolution of these themes in the financial sector. So if you're interested in taking a look at that report, you can find it linked in the resources section of the call. And we also, just as another note, encourage audience participation at any point during the session. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we're going to address those at the end of the call. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and welcome our speakers and bring them in to the discussion now, and we're going to get started with our first question. So as I mentioned in my intro, and as highlighted in our conduct and culture timeline, seems we're seeing a shift towards a higher concentration on conduct and culture in US regulation. And this also reflects what we've seen on the other side of the pond as well from UK regulators like the Financial Conduct Authority, urging fit and proper behavior and focusing on non-financial misconduct. So in general, it seems that focus on ethics is continuously emphasized and expected of employees. And in finance especially, this is paramount since, as we've seen, it influences market integrity and consumer trust. So with that in mind, what would you all say is driving this focus on conduct and culture? Sania, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be very biased because I come from the UK. So I did work for firms that were regulated by the were registered to the FCA. So I think conduct and culture was definitely a key part of any corporate job. Any professional kind of role you take on, it's just an expectation. So it's just business standards, market expectations, and regulatory expectations. But having said that, moving over to North America, I do notice that North America tends to always play catch up when they're trying to compete against the European regulations. So I think that there's a reason why more regulators are speaking to it now and speaking more about it. But I think in terms of the expectation of regulators, they have always expected compliance officers to look out for any breach of conduct and expect, that the registered individuals or employees at their organization are adhering to the company's policies, which definitely ties back into culture. So I think EU was definitely a driver when it comes to many, regulations like market abuse and various others. But I think there's a reason why North American regulators like SEC, et cetera, are speaking more, openly about it, because they're seeing so many failings, which is shocking, right? You'd expect, given all of us, like we're all from the corporate world, like it just goes without saying, we all need to, meet the good conduct standards that are expected of us. So it's really interesting seeing, as in hearing your question, but also seeing the market here. It's very different in that sense. But generally speaking, within the financial services, the market standards have always remained the same. There are, practices and conduct policies in place around everyone that works or is working towards meeting, the market requirements. And that includes your code of conduct, and it includes the culture that you bring to the table. So it's really interesting, but I think more so with off-channel communications being a forefront of the fines this year and last year, we're hearing more around the conduct breaches, right? Because that's where you're picking up people's misconduct through WhatsApp channels and various others. So I don't think it's new. I don't think this is a revelation in any way. I think this is just an expectation, but I think the North American regulators are just speaking to it much more because they're shocked at what they're seeing in the market today. That's my 2 cents on it anyway.
Well, I can definitely think about some instances where I was personally shocked with what I saw. But in general, I do think that nowadays our society is transforming in a sense that it's becoming more and more important for people to focus on inclusivity, to focus on mental health, to focus on fairness. And today I brought data for everyone just to prove that what I'm saying is actually
stats.
true. Yes, yes, you're welcome. So Pew Research Center says that 67% of adults in the US believe companies have a responsibility to address social issue. And this is a big increase because 2 decades ago, they were only 40% voting like that. So I'm constantly impressed with this statistics, and I think that now it's safe to say that ethics, conduct and culture, and also human rights can no longer be considered a niche or a sector or one point in reporting, but rather it has to be a way of thinking and a way of behaving that goes through the whole structure. And I think it's more like a habit that you have to develop when you're working and when you act on behalf of the organization. And we can see the same needs represented within the consumer behavior as well. Again, some statistics. So Nielsen study says that 73% of global consumers state that they definitely change consumption habits to reduce environmental impact, which means that businesses should also prioritize conduct and culture to support their customers. And then, based on that, we can say that the financial sector is, of course, very much influenced by that, because we can see the same needs within the investment world, where people are focusing more and more on social issues, where ethics is an important consideration when they're making a certain investment. And then when you were talking about a lot of matters that kind of disappoint you in a way, I would say that ethics is extremely important for the purposes of ESG reporting, because nowadays there are so many standards that people and organizations try to adhere to, but it's very important to understand how conduct and culture is structured within the organization so that these ESG standards can be actually implemented.
Thank you. Before I add my comments to this question, I would just like to say today that the views and opinions I'll be expressing today are of my own, and they do not reflect the views and opinions of my firm. But now going back to your question, Catherine, on higher concentration on conduct and culture in the US regulation. In the recent years, there has been a shift in regulatory philosophy, right? We're moving away strictly from punishing the bad behaviors to actually positively fostering a culture where we're discouraging misconduct, right? And also, like you mentioned, global regulators have a sustained focus on conduct and culture. But here in the US, we are trying to align with the global trends, right? Especially with the firms that are multinational, right? We need to make sure that we adhere to the cross-border regulations. And again, this has that increased focus on the ethical culture as part of international regulatory framework. Again, nothing new, right, as you mentioned. We've seen this before, it's been going on for years. Wells Fargo fake accounts was a perfect example of this, right, where it shows how failures in conduct and culture at multiple levels within an organization, how that can impact the firm and its clients. And just putting aside, right, finance world, even outside of finance, let's take Boeing, for example, right? Their focus shifted from being safety to just producing quotas, right? And FAA had to give them a notice on focusing on safety and quality concerns rather than production. So.
Yeah, all really great points, and definitely, like you said, Banal, great point to keep in mind. We are focused, with even though we're focused on finance here, it's clear that this translates across industries, and like with Boeing, and really just impacts the quality and long-term success of a business. And also, as you all mentioned as well, we're seeing enforcements across regulation for conduct and culture, and I know in this past year as well, we've seen from FINRA some around client best interest, and we've also seen some on like standards of commercial honor and things along those lines. So I think it's clear how, how much regulators really are zoning in on this and showing that they don't have a tolerance for it as much anymore. And to that point of zero tolerance, we've also seen more of an emphasis on calling out or reprimanding misbehavior. And we've seen this in the form of sizable rewards for whistleblowing and, push for cooperation. Even in the SEC's recent enforcement results, we've seen a lot of that. And, with cooperation or whistleblowing, we've even seen alleviated fines for firms. So I think it really drives that point home. And in general, it just seems conduct is tied into these ideas, especially when it comes to working with the regulators to uphold that market integrity. So my question is, while historically maybe it was easier to get away with certain misdeeds, that intolerance just continues to grow. So what would you say the impact poor ethics has on a firm's operations and compliance? Banal, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So while historically certain conduct events may have been accepted, right, that approach has definitely shifted. So poor ethics, again, as everybody knows, right, can cascade into so many negative effects for the firm. So not just financial penalties, legal issues, right, and also just a toxic work environment for the firm, right? Ethical lapses may sometimes provide a short-term gain, but if you look at long-term, right, whereas your financial, operational, or reputational risk, it's only going to last so long. But also, as you noted, Catherine, let's look at JPM's recent enforcement action, right, where regulators are foregoing of fines, where if you're cooperating with them and also self-reporting a lot of things, right, they are supporting you and they're trying to work with you and kind of lessen the fine. So that's definitely helpful, right? Everybody's well aware of that. So again, that also tries to push that culture where conduct, right, if you see something, say something, self-report it, it's only going to be beneficial for the firm at the end of the day. Also, with the rise of AI in finance, new challenges have emerged, right, where in terms of reassuring clients and investors that the technology that we're using is being used reasonably and responsibly, right? And again, there's always a growing focus where firms are expected that financial conduct is consistent with ethical guidelines, especially when using the tech. And SEC's rule of predictive analytics was a perfect example of this regulatory focus, where they would require advisors to mitigate any conflicts of interest, specifically in relation to use of technology, predictive technology.
Well,
Yeah.
Those are great points, especially on technology matters, because we never know how it will play out in the end. There are so many different matters happening right now, but I do think that in general, of course, once again, poor ethics will not lead to anything good. But once again, I have data for you to show that.
Keep it coming. We love your data points.
Of course, we have to, because I think there are so many people nowadays that doubt certain statements and they want some numbers to see if they can trust this or that statement. So I came prepared today. So I have some data to show that basically lacking ethical standard in culture is unsustainable. There's data from Ethics and Compliance Initiative that says that companies with weak cultures experience a higher rate of misconduct, with half of employees in firms reporting they witnessed unethical behavior, compared to 20% in firms with strong ethical frameworks. And I think this is a very
It's a huge.
it's huge, really. And then if we speak about the influence that poor ethics is taking nowadays, I think basically the responsiveness against that is growing more and more. Because if we look historically, a lot of different organizations and companies could win their customers or their investment through the fact that they were based somewhere in a unique position, in a unique country, and they basically had access to particular markets. But nowadays, because of AI, because of different innovations and internet and things like globalization, it's not really an argument anymore that, oh, I have access to this particular market or to this particular country. Now, when people look at an organization, they make a decision if they want to support this organization, if they want to invest, and things like that based on their own personal values, and this is where ethics really comes in. And then if an organization has poor ethics, this can have a very bad long-term effect on trust of their consumers and other organizations. And speaking about other organizations, I do think that poor ethics is basically going to bring in more lawsuits. And very soon. We already see some trends in this sector. For example, there is a great nonprofit called Client Earth, and they've been basically looking into different matters on conduct and culture, not only that, and trying to prosecute those companies. And I do think that in a certain sense, they have to find a narrative of where kind of the ethics are important, but where just, corporate structures should still be upheld. But it is a trend that will continue to grow, and we will see more and more nonprofits and civil society organizations trying to push forward to have a more transparent and good ethical corporate culture.
Yeah.
I agree, and culture starts at the top, right? We also want to make sure that the leadership doesn't consistently demonstrate organization's core values, then it's really hard for those to permeate down to the broader organization, right? Let's just look at LPL CEO, for example, right? He was fired for not meeting firm's conduct expectations, so board decided to let him go, even though, despite of LPL's financial situation under him, right? Additionally, I believe that performance matrix should not only link to financial outcomes, but also with adherence to ethical standards, right? To help ensure that employees are long-term focused and they do care about firm's reputation, but also the clients, end of the day.
I think I want to go back to the point you made earlier about self-reporting as well. Around the zero tolerance from the regulators. I know, I think a couple of us were at an industry conference earlier this year, and the focus there was, that I think it was the SEC and the DOJ, they both said it right, that they have a percentage, discount percentage structure for anyone that self-reports. And that's the first I've heard of in my whole career in compliance. I don't know if you agree as well.
Agreed.
Yeah, so taking the nodding as yes. But, it's the first time that they said they literally have a structure in-house. They're not going to share the percentage, discount they're going to give, but depending on how forthcoming you are about the risks you have at your firm, but also about, anything you want to self-report, they will take it on board and they will give you a discount on the penalties that you may have faced otherwise. And again, been to many conferences before, been to many SEC-led conversations. I've never heard that before.
And you hear this more and more now, right?
Yeah.
Self-reporting is the key, and just work with the regulators when they're at the firm, right? And just
exactly. It's definitely crazy times, but it also shows the willingness of the regulators to help. They're opening their doors, they're saying, please come forward with any issues. And then, it should encourage and empower compliance officers to speak up, right? And not just compliance officers, employees at these organizations that are seeing issues around conduct or culture. So it's really interesting. So my biggest thing here is definitely cooperate with the regulators. I know there's many people out in the industry that say speak to your lawyer first before you cooperate. I don't agree. I think you should cooperate with the regulators, especially if you're in the compliance field. That's the whole purpose of our roles as compliance practitioners, to use that channel and benefit from it, because they are creating a platform for you to approach and share your concerns. And then it all kind of leads back to like market fairness anyway. We all operate in a market that's highly regulated. There are principles in place. There are core expectations of anyone that works in organizations, whether you're an analyst, whether you're a seasoned professional that's been in the industry 20, 30 years, there's an expectation. So we all need to go home and think about our culture, our conduct. Like, it falls down to every individual at the organization. So,
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, great points. And to your points, I know we've even seen fines for firms who ban employees from self-reporting or whistleblowing, and kind of impede that ability to effectively communicate and allow regulators that transparency. So really demonstrates how these regulators are encouraging measures and looking to really retain that full transparency. And in addition to that, it also, another big portion of the conduct and culture discussion is just that training and educational portion as well. And those are some of the most influential methods in really cultivating that culture that you want to see. Within communications that are dispersed in organizations, purpose should be clear, the risk awareness should be clarified, expectations should be emphasized, and a big point here is just really revamping those codes of conduct and really specifying examples within trainings of the behavior you want to see. So leaders do really need to think about how to manage those requirements and deal with issues as they arise, and also exemplify and communicate that conduct they want to see to set the example they're looking for. So in terms of that, what would you say the specific steps are that those in leadership positions should take to really drive the importance of that proper conduct home? And also kind of how can these goals and effective tone at the top, which I know is a phrase we hear often, how can that be achieved? Vlada, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you. Before we speak about particular steps and particular tools, I would like to speak about this tone at the top. What is that? Why are so many people talking about this tone at the top, but no one really is able to describe it? I will try to do it in the best way I can. I think it's a lot about emotional intelligence. It's about building up the emotional intelligence of a person who is a leader in an organization. It's truly important to understand that nowadays soft skills and psychological health is important, and understanding how you take care of yourself and also of your employees in this way is extremely important. And I also think about our nowadays leaders within organizations as public figures, as potentially even someone who can relate to the picture of public figures as judges and politicians and things like that. And I do think that when you hold an official role, you have to hold a particular image of yourself that will not only be during a particular meeting or during a particular instance when you have to speak publicly, but generally the way how you behave throughout your day is something that really has to be more acknowledged and discussed when someone is holding a leadership position. But now let's talk about particular tools that can be used. I do think that training programs, then well-defined internal compliance documents, and also creating regular check-ins through different methods with your employees could lead to a better ethical culture. And once again, I have some data for you that ethics and ethics and compliance initiative says that companies that implemented regular ethics training saw a 40% reduction in incidents of unethical behavior and increased employee willingness to report concerns by 50%. I think these are big numbers. And I also wanted to speak about one other very powerful tool that I think should be considered. This is mediation. And there's one great example of a successful mediation practice in IBM's open door policy, where basically, in case an employee was not able to achieve, to raise awareness of a particular issue with the immediate supervisor, they are able to raise concerns with higher level management, and this kind of mediation has been considered very successful.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And now that you've talked about how it's effective, I just wanted to add some points on what should be done, right, for this to be working at all firms. So the surveillance strategy should have a clear and communicated purpose, focused on ensuring safety and compliance rather than micromanaging employees, right? And how do we do that? Employees should be informed about what is being monitored and how are these systems being used, right? And why is that? Because once you give that a clear message on why these systems are working and why we need them, right, it builds transparency amongst your employees. Also, leaders should model these behaviors, right? Again, we keep hearing this over and over again, that tone from the top, right? Modeling the behaviors that you want to see from your employees. So leaders should also model behaviors expected from employees by just demonstrating ethical standards in fairness and applying these surveillance policies, right? Collect the data to identify opportunities on where the employees needs to work better rather than using them as a got you tool, right? And disciplining them, because I feel like that's also very effective. Just being as open and clear as possible on why and how we're doing things and involving a broader organization, that's always beneficial. And to add to your point about market surveillance earlier, take a look at the SEC, right? When they established the CAT, Consolidated Audit Trail, that was for the regulators to track all trading activities for purpose of market surveillance, and also insider trading investigations in many cases have prompted regulators to look into any of the main events based on this. So again, all beneficial. Surveillance tools are great, right? They're working, regulators are also implementing them, but just make sure that they're well communicated within the firm.
I think you made some really good points, and also with you, Vlada, just want to say I love the stats, love the data points. We all need it. But yeah, to go back to the tone from the top, it's not, I strongly believe, yes, it does start from the top at any organization. But I also think as individuals, again, we have to hold ourselves accountable. We need to create a fair and just market, and an environment where the future generations want to work in this, right? It's the next generation of corporate culture. Post-COVID, everyone's thinking twice about how we approach this topic, but also more so in North America with all the regulators speaking about it, right? I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think we can continue doing all the training, we can get all the tools in place, but it's down to each individual, right? Each of us, even on this panel, we all have some sort of responsibility to go back and, foster this good culture environment, essentially. So I think it's all down to everyone in this room, all of us. But I do think it does start from the top. But with compliance specifically, again, being a compliance practitioner, I think we already, as compliance officers, we are constantly looking for breach of conduct, right? And we're flagging individuals that, aren't necessarily sticking to the company's policies, etc. But let's create some sort of incentives to allow those that are sat next to, individuals that aren't necessarily above board, that they can feel comfortable in flagging those people. I know we'll speak to it later, but essentially creating an environment where people can raise the alarm if they feel they need to, creating a comfortable environment where they don't feel judged by doing that, because sometimes you do have conversations with an analyst breaching a manager or saying that a manager's not speaking in a way that they feel comfortable. So we need to create that environment that we can provide feedback without anyone getting in trouble straight away. There are ways, and I agree with mediation as well, Vlada. I think it definitely can help with that. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think all these points are interconnected and really equally significant, and I think that the incentives, as you mentioned, Sonia, is something that really drives the point home as well and emphasizes that good behavior is being recognized. And just also in general with the training, having those real world or in-person trainings and examples also kind of helps people connect and resonate as well, which is another good tool to use. So kind of along with that and the training and education portion of it, which I know we spoke to a little bit, when it comes to controlling and regulating these topics, it seems like comp surveillance is a beneficial element. And we were talking about the education and training portion, which are crucial steps. But another aspect is implementing that surveillance to monitor adherence and ensure that everything and everyone is kind of staying in line with those policies. So how can firms implement a successful surveillance strategy that really bolsters that positive culture you want to see and reassures that proper conduct? And with all of these points considered, how does everything work together to really ensure that good culture is being exemplified? Sonia, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to your compliance programs at your organizations. And by this point, honestly, I expect all firms to have a compliance program or a compliance mandate or even a risk assessment. And I think if you go back to that, well, everyone should be going back to it as often as possible and reviewing the risks that are addressed there. But I think going back to it with a lens of, okay, let's look for any conduct issues, any issues that we think we need to raise to the regulators around, our conduct as a firm, but also how we can feed back to HR and legal around the culture, what we need to do to encourage more around good culture in our organization. So yeah, definitely starting off at the compliance program level, that helps. But if we're feeding into the surveillance side, definitely a space of compliance that I personally enjoy talking about. But essentially looking at your surveillance programs, ensuring that you're not just looking at market abuse, you are also capturing misconduct. And so anyone in the room or anyone that's watching, if you're based in the European markets, I think it goes without saying, so I'm not giving you a lecture, but I think it's North American markets, we need to catch up. We're not just, the North American regulators are not just here looking for breach of market abuse controls, and they're not just looking for, insider trading, they are looking at conduct. Because if someone has bad conduct and they're always flagged about their conduct in work channels, client conversations, that person will eventually be one of the rogue traders you're going to be interested in, right? That could potentially perform some sort of market abuse. And there's always a trend between that, right? So, and I'm sure Vlad will probably get some stats for us later, but essentially looking at the compliance programs, making sure that your tools that you're using are capturing the conduct issues as well as the market abuse issues. Obviously working from Global Relay, it's something that we're constantly focused on. Our product team is, constantly developing policies to ensure that we are capturing market abuse as well as conduct breaches, especially now with all the off-channel communication fines, and especially now with the movement, the next generation of business using WhatsApp, using all these other informal channels that was considered informal 5-6 years ago, So it's an interesting time, but I think the advice to everyone in the compliance space, in the surveillance space, look at your vendors, speak to your vendors, get information from them around, who, what everyone's using in the market. Are they enhancing their conduct controls? If so, get some, pointers from them on how you can enhance yours. And definitely speak to your compliance peers. We all speak to each other, and I know people in the room will do the same.
Yep. I mean, just to add quickly to that, right? Again, the goal should be to use surveillance as a supportive framework for promoting ethical behavior.
Yeah.
And that's the key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's a good thing to keep in mind that surveillance helps ensure that professionalism and, in dealing with clients or colleagues, and also just as kind of like a method of protection as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
A good point there. What are your thoughts, Vlada?
Well, I would mix it up a little bit in terms of how can we still make sure that everything is in order and that everything is happening as it has been written and planned, but at the same time, how we can do that in such a way that is more co-creative. So maybe a softer approach than just, pure surveillance. So I would like to speak more about mediation. And I heard that earlier during our conversation today, someone said, I think it was you, Sonia, that don't come to lawyers, like go right ahead and everything. I would
You
say
can use
bring
your
it.
lawyers, you can. I just say, as
Yeah,
compliance
no.
officers, we should definitely go to the regulators
I
as
would
well.
say bring in lawyers earlier, at earlier stages.
Work with your legal team.
Yeah,
Yeah.
work with your legal team. Don't come when there is already an issue.
Yeah.
Make them those with whom you co-create certain practices. And I would like to use mediation as an example of these practices. So basically, let's take a small step back and think about how does an employee feel when there is an issue and maybe they did something that they don't feel right about. What are their feelings? What do you think?
Generally, they're going to be nervous, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to be worried that they're going to lose their job.
Yes,
half the
yes.
time.
Guilt
Guilt.
as well,
Yeah.
anxiety, and feeling that if they speak up, they will be punished. So this is already a very strong emotional barrier for someone to go
especially if
forward.
they're in their early years as well.
Yeah.
I feel like, you know, if you
Yeah.
haven't got the years of experience, you know, you tend to be a bit more nervous about flagging any issues, right?
Yeah, exactly,
So-
exactly. So such tools as mediation, they create a safe space where it's not us against you or me against you, but more us against the problem. And I think this is really a deal breaker in a sense that it creates alignment between employees and leadership. And sometimes when I'm training people in mediation, I say, imagine we're all in the same boat. And if we start arguing with each other, we will not reach the shore. We will not reach the goal. We'll just argue and maybe sink or whatsoever. So we have to imagine that we are all in the same boat, and then we are trying to achieve something, to achieve clarity, to achieve an understanding how something happened and how to avoid it in the future. And this really creates a proactive space where employees can feel heard. And I do think building up this trust is extremely important. And also, as a lawyer, I can say that this kind of mediation techniques help prevent disputes from developing into legal and reputational issues. I want to use one example of this successful mediation technique when it goes a little bit beyond internal corporate matters. There is a great legal project called Responsible Contracting Project, and it deals with supply chain matters and how do you contract in between different suppliers so that there is a space of trust where people can raise different concerns, but they will not feel worried that they will lose their income because they reported something within the supply chain. So I think it's a very successful example of how you can use mediation or creating safe spaces in order to become better in surveillance.
I think with the mediation, just to kind of tie up on that bit as well, if you use mediation, it helps train your organization. It shows, yes, you are welcome for feedback, because no one's perfect from day one, right? It takes time to get to that, and no one will ever be 100% perfect. The regulators will find more things to look for. But what will help, especially around the self-reporting that we've been speaking to earlier today, if the regulator sees that you're doing everything you possibly can at your organization to mitigate risk, the regulator would be much more lenient on you. If they see, for example, the legal team have got involved earlier on in the journey and helped, re-educate and build awareness around these risks. So I want to take a bit of my comment back. Definitely speak to your legal team, but don't speak to them when it's too late. But also don't think you can't speak to the regulator, because you can. So yeah, I do agree with you with mediation. I think it can definitely help you before something gets very serious. So
Yeah, definitely. I think all good points. I think they all really tie together to give people that positive culture and help cultivate that positive culture. I think that point you mentioned of having it be us working towards the problem versus working against each other is really important too. I think, it's easy for things to turn towards one person if they're maybe not meeting a standard, but I think working together on those solutions really gives that proactive approach that you're looking for and helps promote that long-term success within organizations as well. So yeah, all really great points there. And all these ideas considered, I would say, with just kind of like a more of a quick question to wrap things up here with our discussion. Kind of looking ahead, do you see regulators continuing this concentration and possibly maybe even dishing out fines related to non-financial misconduct against firms or individuals? Vlada, what are your thoughts on that?
A lot of people could say no right now, but I will say yes. Because I do believe that currently nonprofit civil society organizations and just people globally are aiming to have a more transparent future and culture
Yeah.
within firms. So yes.
I think I'm going to jump in there and say I agree with you. I do think a lot of people will potentially say no, but I think with my optimism here, I 100% believe that regulators won't stop. They will continue. Conduct issues and culture in general is definitely a key focus. It's part of the next generation of corporate compliance, but also within the corporate world and the professional world. So I hope we continue with the fines in terms of failings in this space, but also given the changes in North America with the political structure changing slightly, I don't know. I'm not as positive with that. So
Yeah, and no, it's a great segue. And to add to your point, while the pace of regulatory rulemaking may slow down under the new administration, I feel that it's quite possible that banking and securities regulators would agree with me that we will see a shift in rulemaking through enforcement process, right, with the conduct being a primary focus from the enforcement perspective, particularly in response with emerging challenges with financial tech and investor protection.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that ties into the point you made earlier about AI as well. And, it'll be interesting to see how that evolves with more of these emerging technologies. And, also I think as we've seen, it's clear how much of a priority this is really becoming to regulators. But it also will be interesting to see kind of how initiatives develop as regimes change and and as we look forward. So
Absolutely.
all really great
exciting
points there.
times in compliance,
Yes.
right?
Keeping us on our toes.
Exactly. Awesome. All right. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the Q&As we have. We'll move into that portion of the session. So let me take a look here. So one good question we had come up here is with DEI being a constant focus in the financial services and most recently a regulatory expectation, how would you all say this ties into conduct and culture?
It's I'll take that one if that's
Yeah.
okay. It's definitely crucial, right, for positive conduct culture within an organization, and this is why, right? DEI, it makes people feel respected and valued, right, and that builds trust. It also encourages open communications. Once, as we mentioned a couple of times today, right, throughout the discussion, that once employees feel safe to express their thoughts, right, whether it's self-reporting or any other issues that they want to raise, if they feel inclusive, if the firm is inclusive, right, they feel comfortable bringing those things up. Also, it encourages open communication, promotes fairness, right, where equity ensures all employees have access to everything, the same opportunities within the organization. Also supports behavioral norms and enhances employee engagement and firm reputation.
I think it all ties into culture as well. This is a key part of culture, right? If you don't have your DEI initiatives, and if you don't, one, have an initiative in place, but constantly adjusting and changing it to the current environment, then your culture, then I'd question your culture, the company culture, right? So this is a big deal, and it's something I love talking about, and I think we have so much more to do, which is kind of upsetting to say because we're in 2024 and I've been in the industry like just over 10 years now, and this is something we spoke about when I first joined the industry. So I think we need to do a lot more around DEI and breaking into each segment of DEI, right? And then once you feel comfortable that you're meeting the needs of everyone in your organization in some way or another, I think then you're getting closer to ticking the box of, do we have good culture in place? But again, that feeds into conduct, right? If you have good culture, if you have an open door policy, if you create an environment where people feel comfortable to speak up and feel empowered to speak up, right? That's then going to change that culture. That's then going to also reduce the conduct issues that we're facing, but also allow for that growth, right? And it all works hand in hand. So
It does, very important in shaping
It's definitely a
organizations'
key part.
culture.
I would also add that there's a need to have a certain balance, I would say, because as you said, if someone is constantly adjusting, their internal policies within DEI that could raise concerns, but at the
Yeah.
same time, it is a matter that it's still broadly discussed. There are so many issues that have to be understood. And speaking about emotional intelligence once again, these are some matters that are kind of non-tangible. So this is very difficult to understand where it has to be a strict regulation or where it has to be, let's say, a safe space where people can think and feel open about certain things. And I would say that in my view, it's extremely important to co-create these matters and to be able to have all of the different stakeholders heard when certain adjustments are made, but then being able to give these adjustments certain time and adhere to those adjustments to make sure that you are consistent in a certain way. But it's definitely a long co-creation process that needs to be balanced in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. You know, kind of going back to the point you made, Sonia, I think it really does all just tie together, you know, with having that speak up culture, cultivating a positive culture where people feel empowered. You know, I think it really ties into just having productivity as well, just having that good, just good environment where people feel like they can really succeed. So,
and their voice matters, right?
Exactly.
And again, kind of going back to the point, if you're new in the industry, you're going to hold back. Like naturally, we were all analysts and on entry roles, very years ago. But when you come in, you kind of don't want to rattle any feathers. But that shouldn't be the case. You know, we should always encourage people to speak up. So once you create that culture, you then have more openness. You know, with newbies. Should we say?
Yeah, and that also helps with retention, right?
Yeah.
When employees are happy, they feel safe that they can speak up on these issues or bring any concerns to light. They're more likely to stay with the firm long term.
I wish we had stats on that actually, because I'm sure I read it somewhere. No, I was just thinking that now. Like, I genuinely feel like there definitely is some stats out there showing, you know, the retention rates of, especially some of the big firms, some of the big banks out there. You know, what is it for anyone that's up to that VP level? It's interesting actually, because I know many people, you know, in the UK, you'd move around every year because you're trying to quickly work through the ranks, but also there's a lot down to conduct and culture. You didn't want to be part of an organization that necessarily wasn't ticking those boxes for you. And I think with the new generation, it's definitely a forefront of, you know, their questions in interviews, like, what is your culture like?
Yeah.
Like, I know you speak to it, but can you show me examples? Because they're making a huge commitment joining your firm. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting one.
All tied in.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's important to people, and I feel like we're seeing that more. So yeah, all really important, great points. Let me take a look at some of our other questions here. So we have one that came in. We haven't had an interesting one come in right here. So do you feel regulators should be more prescriptive when it comes to what they feel good conduct and culture looks like? Really interesting question there.
I think it's interesting, if you don't mind me jumping in on
Please.
this one. I think it's interesting. I think we always ask the regulators to be more prescriptive with everything, right? But it's so difficult for the regulators in some cases to define every issue that they're looking for and everything they consider of concern. And, you know, it's difficult because you can't always list all the possible scenarios, right? I do think the North American regulators, especially in the last year, through fines, enforcements, everything else, but also at the event, the roundtables we've been at and all the conferences that are out there for compliance and legal professionals, they have been open. And, you know, the fact that they're so open and forward about their self-reporting program, but also they've been very clear about their expectations when they come in for a regulatory examination. They are looking at conduct, they are looking at culture. But I also think if you know, and this is me playing devil's advocate, I think if that question is coming up, I think it's good to go back and speak to your legal team, your compliance team, your risk functions, and understand that problem as a collective and see if there are more questions around, you know, what do we need to do? What more can we do? Because, you know, I think there's enough talented individuals in this industry, and I think we just need to get together and, you know, come together and, you know, create some action items from it. But also, I think the regulators can only do so much, right? They're being very I would say, as transparent as they can be this year. And I'm sure we were talking about this earlier, like, they are providing as much direction as they can. But now it's kind of like, come on, let's use our brains now and let's start, moving and making changes. But I also think leadership at organizations need to be way more involved than they have been. And again, tone from the top, right? Like, you need to, it's not just the tone, it's their input, their feedback on the risks that we're talking about. So yes, they can be more prescriptive, but again, if they do go ahead and start writing books on what you should be doing, then we're all in trouble, because if they find an issue, you're going to have a large fine on your lap after that reg examination. So it's a difficult one to balance, I think, for regulators.
Absolutely. And to add to Sonia's point, right, you just want to make sure that if something feels wrong or uncomfortable, right, most likely it is. So just pay attention to that, right? Discuss amongst your team, your compliance, legal, risk functions, right, before you go out to the regulator or ask any other firms, right? Also, make sure that what you're saying is actually what you're doing, right? Very important from what I've seen in a lot of SIFMA conferences or any other regulatory webinars, right? That if you're saying something, make sure you have those written policies in place.
Yeah.
And once you have those written policies in place, make sure that you're actually doing those things. It's just not on paper. So when the regulators do come in, right, it's on paper it looks great, but are you actually doing those things? And what governance process you have? I feel like once you have those things covered, you can't go wrong.
To add to that as well, it's like we see a lot of time people have documentation, but then organizations, as in that data or that information hasn't been shared, right? So the legal and the compliance team have all the policies, but then the wider organization do not know anything about it. And so when they get interviewed, these issues come up, and then the regulators are like, okay, so we know you've got a program, but no one knows about the program, so what's the point?
Right.
So yeah, definitely having the policies, sharing it, educating, and awareness.
Yep.
Well, I can add 2 points. They're kind of a little bit diverse because they address different points that you've raised. So one point is, I think instead of clarifications, there is a need for like streamlining certain initiatives, because I do see nowadays, especially within sustainability and ESG space, there are a lot of great initiatives within the regulatory sphere, but then there's no streamlining of those initiatives. So I do think this is a little bit even more important than clarifying everything. And then another point, more to the internal reporting and setting certain policies within an organization. I do think that here, once again, speaking about emotional intelligence and things like that, it is important for us to be realistic, because I think we as humans, we want to set up standards that will say, like, we will do our utmost best and we will achieve the highest goals and things like that, but then in reality it will be impossible to do so. So I also think it's important when someone is creating certain internal reporting policies to understand that no matter how much we would like to write that we will be the best, the first, and things like that, it's truly important to understand what you can and cannot do for now, and being realistic and seeing these things is actually a very good way to grow forward and maybe one day to become the best or the first and things like that.
Absolutely, really great points. I feel like the underlying message that regulators just really keep pushing is just having that integrity and that professionalism, and then at that point just having, as a firm, just building those policies, as you all are mentioning, building those policies around it and really enforcing them and just dispersing them, having those frequent trainings like we were talking about, all help to actually really drive that point and make sure and ensure that you're meeting that
showing
that
every effort, right? Every effort has been made. You've tried your very best, because you can only do your best, right? And so the regulators understand that, they do sympathize and they understand. So
absolutely, all really great points there. And then it looks like we have time for, we'll just do one more question here. So let me take a look here. I see we have one here. So the SEC is awarded a record number of whistleblowing awards this year. So would you say this is encouraging good conduct or indicative of increasingly bad conduct? So interesting question there. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I think I think it's interesting. I think we've been speaking about it a lot. Like, you know, the everything around whistleblowing policies and everything. Yes, it does. It should encourage good conduct, but surprisingly, not always. Because there's always someone that thinks they're above the law. There's always someone that thinks they don't need to stick to that rule because they're very senior, or they're a very successful salesperson bringing in money for that organization. So they're like, nope, the rules don't apply to me. But I think if anything, the SEC is again pushing to the market and pushing to regulated firms to do more, and that they are going to push for a no tolerance policy. So it's interesting. I think definitely it should encourage good conduct, but I think there's always going to be a bad actor no matter where you go.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I feel that it's both good and bad, right? Because on one hand, it's encouraging that ethical behavior, that speak up if you see something, right, unusual or not in line with your policies, say something about it. But at the same time, it kind of suggests the structure is not strong enough to self-regulate, right? Because again, there's a good balance. Like, do you really need to be rewarded for you to say something or fix something when it's not wrong, right? It's just not right. I'm sorry, but I think it's a bit of both.
I think because I'm generally an optimist, I think it is good in a sense that the more we have an opportunity to talk about certain things, even if there are bad actors, just because even those bad actors will be hearing more and more and more and more about something, then psychologically it always has an effect on us. So if we speak about that, I think it's a positive development.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all really great points there. I think that it seems like we're just we're seeing regulators are focusing more on the topic, and it seems like firms are as well. So I think that's the point there to keep in mind, is it's just that concentration is growing. So
And here to stay.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. All right, so it looks like we're pretty much almost at time here. So I'm gonna wrap it up there. Gonna wrap it up there. So thank you all for tuning in for our session today. And thank you again to our excellent speakers for joining and sharing their insight on this topic. And once again, just as I mentioned earlier, we recently released the timeline on conduct and culture. So if you're interested in taking a look at that, it is linked in the resources section of the call. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you for joining. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.